Okay, so continuing on from this morning we looked at writing, this afternoon at submission. So the aims this afternoon are to share hints with you for selecting a journal, to introduce the basics of copyright, to clarify what editors look for, to show the importance of a cover letter, to discuss internal and external peer review, and then to explain the essentials of revision. So it's about that journey from selecting a journal through to publication. By the tea break at the end of this session, you'll be better able to select a journal for your manuscript. You'll be aware of the basics of copyright. You'll know what editors look for in submissions. You'll be able to write a strong cover letter. You'll understand what editors look for in reviews. And you'll be ready to revise with confidence. So the first question about submission where is, why do you want to submit the paper? What are you trying to accomplish with this research? And there are going to be many reasons for publication at different stages of your career. So different readers, different audiences who you will want to make contact with. It's good to start by asking, what goals do you want to achieve? Is it early versus late career advancement? Do you want to change practice? Perhaps it's because you want to fulfill the ethical obligation to publish your findings. So you're not too worried about where you publish, but you need to publish the paper. You may wish to support a sponsor, or if you're a department head, you might be wanting to develop your staff, help them to publish somewhere that will enhance their career. Again, like this morning, we come back to that question of who do you want to reach? Is your reader a clinician, a policymaker, or perhaps a funder? A generalist or a specialist? Are they local, within the Pacific region, or perhaps international? And what type of health system do they practice in? Taiwan is at an incredible advantage here, because having a universal health coverage system, the types of research that you do here may be directly transferable to universal health coverage systems around the world, and can help inform them at many different stages of development. So, keep that reader in mind. Imagine that reader is still sitting in the corner chair in your office as you choose where to submit your manuscript. So have a profile of the reader. What manuscripts, what journals will your reader be reading, and how will she or he access them? For instance, we're talking electronic access, access through a library account, or perhaps open access for any type of reader anywhere. English language or another language. And then, having profiled the reader, profile your manuscript. Think about the topic, the population, the size of your study, and the stage of research. And a very telling question is to ask yourself, could you see your manuscript fitting comfortably in a recent issue of the journal that you'd like to submit it to? So have a look at a recent issue and say, is my manuscript similar? And if you're in doubt, as we said this morning, it's worth looking at your references. Seeing if perhaps some of your references might be a good home for your research paper. And when you think you've found the right journal, then do some research there. Be familiar with it. What's the philosophy of that journal? What are the special interests? Have they published any landmark papers in your field? Particularly be aware of calls for papers, because this is a way of journals signaling directly to you, the author, the types of manuscripts that they're interested in. And then look at the requirements for that journal. First of all, does it have a relevant section? I am astonished by the number of submissions that we receive at the Lancet on animal research when we don't publish animal research in general. And it's a waste of time from the author. They're going to have to start the whole procedure over. So it's just thinking about these little details. That's why it's good to be really familiar with the journal. And what's the format? And what format do they want the article in? Should the abstract be structured or unstructured? What's the length? What supporting material do they require? For instance, at the Lancet, we ask that a protocol accompanies every randomized controlled trial. We ask that each paper has something called a research in context panel, which places that particular study within the totality of what is known about the field. And the journal may want authorship forms and signatures at submission. And if you're in doubt, if you're not sure whether a certain journal would be interested in your article, send them an email. Send them a copy of your abstract or just a few sentences in an email and saying, would you be interested in this type of paper? So that's really useful because it will give you a contact with the journal. And when we come to talk about cover letters at the end of this session, having that name is something you can use in the cover letter. But it's not just enough to be familiar with the journal's requirements. You need to demonstrate that you have followed them. Because a non-standard style of abstract or length or referencing actually stands out in a bad way, particularly when, let's say, the other 30 manuscripts I received that day have all been formatted according to our recommendations. Now, where you want to publish may also depend on the publishing model that you seek. And broadly defined, these fall into two categories. Either the author pays for the manuscript to be published and the user can access it for free, or the author publishes for free, but the user then pays to access the manuscript. There are some variations, but those are the two basic categories. And these can be broken down into, say, a peer-reviewed open access journal. That's one where it goes through rigorous peer review. The author pays, or author institution or funder pays for the publication, and anyone, anywhere in the world can access it and read it for free. There's the peer-reviewed subscription, where people access the article by paying a subscription or a per view charge, or through their institutional library subscription. There are some models, such as in physics, where people may publish the manuscript without peer review, and there is an active peer review process that takes place online after publication. You may have a particular preference for web-based or paper-based, again, depending on who your reader is and how your reader is going to access the manuscript. And then, of course, there are hybrid versions. At the Lancet, we have web, we have paper, we have web only, we have open access, and we have subscription papers, all within the same journal. And publishing is changing very quickly, so undoubtedly, within the next few years, there are going to be other models that come along. related to the publishing model is copyright. But essentially, copyright is a clarification of the rights for authors, those who've created the work, for journals who've added value to it, and for readers who are going to use it. And copyright may be different for different types of material. For instance, the article, the protocol, or if there's any associated video material, or indeed data that may be made available afterwards. So I'm not going to go deeply into copyright, but this is just to give you an overview because someone had asked the question. And there's some material that cannot be assigned to external copyright, such as government employees who are doing research as part of their job. The important message about copyright is that journals differ. And if it's important to you, have a look at the journal. See whether copyright is something that you transfer to the journal or you retain yourself. Now, even if you have transferred copyright to a journal with Elsevier, at least, authors retain the right to non-commercial, personal, institutional, and educational use of their material. So don't be worried that you can't teach with something that has been copyrighted elsewhere. Now, with open access, there's something called a Creative Commons license. And these come in a whole spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum is a very restrictive license that says the author retains copyright and people can only read it, they can't do anything with the material. At the other end of the spectrum is that the author has this copyright, but that anybody can subsequently use the material for any purpose whatsoever, including commercial purposes. So with that type of license, it means that someone else could then, for instance, translate the article and then sell it on in a translation. So there are a whole variety of licenses there. Journals, when an article is accepted, will explain the different license types for that journal. Not every journal offers every license type. So I think it comes down again to who is your reader, how do you want to contact them. Is it going to be a author pays model or a reader pays model, essentially, and then look at the individual journals in terms of how they handle copyright. But for the majority of people, copyright shouldn't be an issue, so I don't want it to be something that's going to bog one down unduly. It would be more a subsidiary thought in choosing the journal, and perhaps more a bridge to cross when you're looking at what kind of license if it's an open access. Now, language will obviously be dependent on the audience you want to reach, but it's important to bear in mind the language of an article for things like literature searches. Obviously, it will depend what language someone is searching in. Perhaps one of the best-known databases is Medline, and that contains about 5,000 journals. So what makes a journal present on Medline? Well, first of all, it has to be a registered publication. It has to meet certain standards in terms of the quality of its content and editing. It has to publish work by different authors. And it has to be a journal that's designed to be published indefinitely. So a Medline indexed journal will keep you visible in Medline searches. Now, Google is wonderful at detecting all sorts of publications, but one has to be aware, particularly for journals that may be considered predatory journals, that once something is published, it may be difficult for readers to access it. Even though it's free to access, it may be difficult to find, or there may be issues about whether it is available in perpetuity there or not. So Medline is one of your guarantees that if you publish in the Medline journal, people are going to be able to find you. And they're open access journals on Medline, so don't worry about that side of it. Now I'd like to move into the editorial side of what happens with submissions. And to begin by saying journal editors want to publish research papers. I'm here because I want to publish more papers from Taiwan. I'm not here because I want to reject more papers from Taiwan. So if you understand what editors are looking for, it may increase your chances of publication in your preferred journal. Now at The Lancet we get about 4,500 research submissions a year. Any idea from anyone of how many we publish? Someone shout out a number?
200.
So looking ahead. You're absolutely right. Genius. 200. So how do we get from 4,500 to 200? Well, first of all, there's triage. So when a manuscript comes in, the deputy editor or another senior executive editor and myself will read through the abstract and the cover letter. We do this blinded, without knowing who the authors are, what the institution is, or what the country is. On the basis of that triage, we may reject up to a third of submissions. The others we will assign to a specialist editor within the Lancet group, someone who has a special expertise in that area. That editor will read the manuscript in full, and if she or he thinks that it is a manuscript of potential interest to our readers, it will be brought to an editorial meeting. We have 2 of them a week, and all the editors will read it and discuss it before deciding whether or not to send that manuscript for peer review. After peer review, it comes back to another editorial meeting, in which case we might invite a revision, and then revisions come back to another editorial meeting before finally being accepted. You can imagine at each stage there is the opportunity to fall off the path. And when that happens, if it's a good paper, but one that we don't quite think is a priority for our general readership, we may well consider one of the other journals within the Lancet family. As oncologists, you'll be familiar with Lancet Oncology, but over the last few years, we've been adding journals each year. This last year, we added gastroenterology and hepatology. This year, public health. We have child and adolescent health coming next year, and planetary health coming next year. So lots of different titles. And therefore, for you as oncologists, and particularly for someone who is let's say, a GI oncologist, who might be looking at depression in hepatocellular carcinoma, that's a paper that might go to the Lancet. It might go to the Lancet Oncology, it might go to the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, or it might go to the Lancet Psychiatry. And if that study was set, say, somewhere in Southeast Asia, in a developing country, you might also consider Lancet Global Health. So there's an overlap between the journals, which is one of the services that we do for authors, is that it actually allows us to accommodate more manuscripts. Well, what do we look for when a manuscript comes in? We want research that's going to change thinking, that's of interest to a wide international audience, First and last publication. Now, where does science begin and end? That's hard to say. But if you imagine an arch, we're interested in that very first stone that establishes the basis of a new idea or new field of practice. And we're interested in this keystone at the top that brings understanding together and consolidates it for another layer above that. Now, in between these 2 points, there are lots of large contributions that are important and substantial, but we would say they're probably better in a specialty journal, perhaps one of the Lancet specialty journals, and it's this paper and this paper which are more the ones that the Lancet, the weekly, is looking for. Obviously, we want it to be ethically sound, methodologically robust, and reported in full. So the common reasons for rejection arise from those, in that it will be research that doesn't change thinking. It may have limited interest to a wide audience. The knowledge may be incremental, part of that arch, but not the bottom or the top of the arch. It could be ethically suspect, or the methods could be inappropriate or not followed. Sometimes it is incompletely reported. There hasn't been the use of reporting guidelines to help us really understand the paper. So if we take another paper, this morning we looked at an oncology paper from Taiwan, published a few weeks ago in the Lancet Oncology. This is a gastroenterology paper, also from Taiwan, published in the Lancet itself a few weeks ago. First thing we notice in the title, we spoke this morning about having a descriptive title with the trial line following it. It's a randomized controlled trial. And over half of what the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine publish are randomized controlled trials. It is a minority of the submissions we receive. So the message from that immediately is that if you submit something that is not a randomized controlled trial, it's competing with many more papers for many fewer spaces. So is that research that's going to change thinking? Well, here there's just a nice little paragraph. And here it says that bismuth quadruple therapy is preferable to 14-day triple therapy in first-line treatment. And it also changes thinking by saying that previous courses for 10 days are probably going to become obsolete. Well, that's a gastroenterology paper. Why wasn't it in the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology? Is it of interest to a wide audience? Okay, well, H. pylori infection is a worldwide problem, and here the authors make quite clear that although the study took place in Taiwan, they've provided tools specifically to look at resistance to make these findings more applicable for any other country in the world. So yes, it fulfills that criteria of wide interest. Now, where does it stand in that arch? We've seen lots of H. pylori papers, many published in the Lancet from Taiwan. Is it first and last? Well, here we see that actually it's a first. It fulfills a need for information that had been highlighted by others. So knowing what editors are looking for makes it that much easier just to incorporate these key sentences in your manuscript, which can make the difference between publication and rejection. We saw this morning how easy it is to add a statement about ethics, and here, nice little statement about institutional review board and written informed consent, further going on to say they provide the protocol. that leads us to the next question of, are the methods robust? And we could check the protocol to make sure that the authors had followed it and reported all the outcomes in full as intended. So here it is, transparency, the enemy of bias. And the more transparent you can become, the more essential information in the paper, the fewer questions to challenge the manuscript from reviewers and editors. So here, when they're talking about the outcomes, you have a list of the outcomes. Times are changing, and nowadays, when we look at outcomes, we're actually wanting to go beyond this. And this is really only within the last few months since this paper was accepted. We would now prefer to see a statement that if there are any outcomes that were pre-specified in the protocol and are not in this manuscript, we want to see a statement listing what those outcomes are and the fact that they will be reported elsewhere. So that just sort of shows the evolution and the increasing efforts to improve transparency. Now, for a randomized controlled trial, one would hope that the consort reporting guideline was followed, and just as I showed you the strobe reporting guideline earlier, consort, and as you go down, you can see how it really walks you through all sorts of things. Talking about masking, talking about adverse events, talking about generalizability. And so if you were writing this manuscript, you would want to make sure that each of those 22 points was included in the manuscript. And given that each one could be addressed really quite simply with a sentence or two, actually this is a very good aid to write. Now the cover letter. A cover letter serves an important function. It's to get your manuscript read. It provides context for the abstract. I would say that 95% of the cover letters that I read do not do justice to the manuscript. And there are a few simple tips that can make the difference between being read and not being read. So, think of the cover letter as the bridge between you and the purpose of getting the editor to read your paper. Think of the reader again. What story are you going to tell the editor? So compose the letter to answer what you think he or she needs to know about the manuscript. And make me want to learn more. So, as I said earlier, editorial triage is the abstract and the cover letter. And as I look through the cover letter, I'm trying to figure out, why are the findings of this paper of interest to readers? And bearing in mind our readers are going to be international, multi-specialty. I want to know, is this novel or is it an end of chapter piece? Is the methodology appropriate and robust? Will it change practice? And perhaps if there are any particular factors that you as the author feel I should know about. Now be brief. A cover letter is not a license to write another manuscript. I would suggest you aim for about 300 words, so it's about the same length as the abstract. Demonstrate in that cover letter an understanding of the journal. Summarize your findings, but don't repeat the abstract, because remember, the abstract is being submitted alongside. So a cover letter that merely repeats the abstract actually misses the opportunity to say more. And it's very important you let the data speak for themselves. Don't try to suggest that the data are telling you something that isn't there. First of all, the greeting. Now remember I said, if you're in doubt, write to a journal. Well, if you get a reply, you can address the cover letter to the editor who replied to you. When I'm doing triage, that's wonderful. I see the person's name. Immediately I pass the manuscript to them. I don't have to read any further, and you've got through the first step of the process. Dear editor, I think is a good, safe, polite, utilitarian opening. Don't do Dear Sir, because the majority of the editors at The Lancet are female, and at most journals as well. But if you have a named editor, that's good. If you are putting Dear Bill at your next letter to The Lancet, please do me a favor and explain why. Say, I sent you an email, or you visited our institution, or something like that. If you use a name, good to check the spelling and update it. Not for me, I don't care how you spell my name. But sometimes people will put in the name of an editor. And if that's misspelled, it looks rather foolish. What's even worse is if it's the name of the editor from the previous journal that you submitted your paper to. And that happens. So in the cover letter, it's a good time to provide some context. What is the medical context? And there are lots of ways you can do this. It could be the burden of disease. You might want to talk about its epidemiology, its disability that it causes, or the cost. Perhaps existing treatments and the fact that they don't work well, or they're burdensome to patients, or they have lots of side effects, or they're expensive. Perhaps you want to talk about the evolving science. Maybe it's a translational medicine piece. Or the new insights that your research brings. There might be external context, a recent or upcoming event. For instance, a health crisis. I had the dubious pleasure one year of arriving in Taipei on the same plane that brought in the first case of avian influenza. And then when we got to the sort of 5-year anniversary, we got lots of papers submitted to us about avian influenza 5 years on. So anniversaries are another good opportunity. 10 years after SARS, we tended to publish about SARS. So on and so forth. We did a recent piece at the anniversary of Hiroshima last year. Perhaps there's an upcoming policy statement, an international meeting. Journals often have calls for papers before the big international meetings, international cardiology conferences, diabetes, surgical conferences. And maybe there's an internal context within the journal. Perhaps the journal has issued a call for papers. For instance, we each year have issued a call for surgery papers for an issue that goes to the American College of Surgeons. So if you're an oncologist and you have colleagues who are surgeons, you may be responding to a call like that, in which case mention it in the opening sentence of your cover letter. You may be responding to a recent publication in the journal, which could be research. You could say how your paper develops that idea, or provides greater insight, or contradicts it. Or it could be an editorial. The editorial said, we need more research. on this type of cancer. You could say, in response to your editorial. And let's say you can't find any reason. The journal hasn't published a call for papers, they haven't mentioned your condition. Then you could say, dear editor, I noticed that in the last 5 years you haven't published one paper on this topic. This is very important. This is why, and I think your readers would like this. That would be the sort of letter that would catch my attention as an editor. You can certainly mention the journal by name. Say, dear editor, I believe that the readers of your journal, or whatever its name, would be interested in this paper because, however, like the editor's name, do remember to change that if you aren't successful with your first cover letter. So why is your manuscript important, to whom and where? And then why is the manuscript important to that particular journal and their readership? Please don't say, I want to publish in Journal X. A far more convincing argument would be, this research can change clinical practice, and Journal X is the most direct way to share these findings with the key practitioners who can implement change. So what's the difference between those two statements? The first statement tells me that you're interested in publishing in a journal. End of story. The second statement tells me you're interested in changing practice. And from a journal's point of view, journals don't look at publication as the end. They look at it as the beginning. So for the journal, they want to be publishing something that's going to be ongoing, that's going to be changing practice. If you must, it's okay to say you think your paper will be highly cited. I'm not wild about reading that. But to say this will improve your impact factor, I think is really quite distasteful. So I'd avoid saying that. That would only appeal to the crudest of journals. You might want to mention the length in the cover letter to show that you've adhered to the journal guidelines. You could, for instance, say, to keep my manuscript within journal guidelines, I have prepared a web appendix with additional information on the methods for reviewers. An entirely reasonable way to do it. You might want to mention that you followed reporting guidelines, that your study is registered, and any supplemental materials that you're submitting. You might also want to mention the history of whether this is the first submission or you've had previous submissions. Now the reason for that is if I had a cover letter that said, we previously submitted to Journal A, we had 3 positive reviews. I enclosed the reviews. We do say enclosed reviews. We encourage that. 3 of them were positive. The journal rejected it, we believe, on the basis of the 4th reviewer. This was a hostile review that we believe was correct. Then, if we send the paper out for review, and we ended up, because we might well choose similar reviewers, getting a hostile review, we might consider that in a different light with your message beforehand. Or you might say, we're submitting it to, let's say, the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, said we previously submitted this manuscript to JAMA, but they felt it was too specialized. So we're seeking a specialist journal. That would be an entirely reasonable way of phrasing your cover letter. If there's anything unusual, anticipate rather than hide it. For instance, any problems with institutional review, with the ethics, and with consent. We're now seeing some trials, randomized controlled trials, where consent is waived, such as a trial we published recently on acute coronary intervention. And because both practices were in standard use, the ethics committee didn't feel that consent was required. If there's a reporting delay, we do wonder when a manuscript comes in 3 years after the work has been completed, why it's taken so long. And if there is a sentence saying, there's been a delay in submission because our statistician was on maternity leave, or there's been a delay in submission because I broke my leg. It's, nothing wrong with that. It's very human, and you'll at least elicit, I think, a more sympathetic response from an editor by sharing things like that. And specifically, let us know about protocol alterations. Of course, you're welcome to propose reviewers in a cover letter, but I suggest only do it if you're asked. The reason for that is I choose my own reviewers, as do the other editors at The Lancet. And if you've mentioned someone, then I would go out of my way not to involve them. So if a rule of thumb, I would allow one author-recommended reviewer. So if you're recommending reviewers, I think, well, maybe these are friends. Maybe you did your PhD with this person 10 years ago. And I would want to make sure I was getting really independent reviewers. So it could actually work against you by giving a big list. Some journals will ask you. If they do ask you, provide them. If they don't ask you, I shouldn't worry about it. You can always say, happy to provide reviewers if you wish. And if you recommend someone, say why. Say this person is the leader in cancer immunology of the gut, for instance, then that's very useful for me to know. You can also mention those people who you would prefer not to review your manuscript, but here I ask you please to use discretion. I have seen as many as 20 different people listed as barred reviewers, and it does make one question, particularly in very specialized fields, quite what's been going on. And I think with the closure of the cover letter, it's nice to express flexibility to make sure that your letter is patient-centered. So keep the reader in mind in the cover letter. Aim for clarity. Don't overestimate the specialist knowledge of an editor. I'm not an oncologist. I'm reading cancer papers every day, but I'm not an oncologist. So bear that in mind, that your editor may have less, what will almost certainly, unless it's a specialist field journal, have less expertise than you. So make sure things are clear for them to understand. Avoid abbreviations, because we all interpret abbreviations differently. And please avoid jargon. So in summary, the length should be as short as necessary to interest, but not to overwhelm the reader. I've seen cover letters of 2 sentences that's just too short, and cover letters of more than 1 page that are too long, and I don't think cover letters like that tend to get read all the way to the end. So aim for the same length as the manuscript, as the abstract, 250 to 300 words. So now I'd like to give you an example of what I think is one of the best cover letters I received. And I'll talk you through why it had an effect on me. This is from a paper about a trial of an EV71 vaccine. So the cover letter began by saying EV71 infection is an important public health issue in Asia-Pacific region and beyond. Okay, so is it of interest to a wide audience? Yes. So I'm going to keep reading. So far, it's a potential paper for The Lancet. Then it tells me about the spectrum of disease. And this is good because it doesn't assume I know anything about EV71. It could have been one sentence. Thank you for considering our paper on EV71 vaccine. But it actually tells me what a problem it is. It tells me what it does. It tells me the burden of disease, 1.6 million cases, 500 deaths in one country. So now this has my attention. So I've already established it's of interest to a wide audience. Now I recognize it's important. Now, if someone told you about a viral illness with this kind of burden, I imagine your immediate reaction would be, why doesn't someone develop a vaccine? And that's what I'm thinking. And so I'm hooked. Because the next sentence, the author tells me, the development of a vaccine is a dynamic topic with paramount relevance for public health. Okay, I'm on the same page with the author. Yeah, that's right. I was just thinking that. So I'm now getting excited about this paper. And I'm thinking, well, I wonder if anyone's tried this vaccine to see if it works. And then they tell me they've done a phase 2 clinical trial. They tell me it's registered, and it's written according to the consort guideline. Okay, at this stage, I'm no longer thinking, do I read the manuscript or not? I'm reading the rest of the letter, already thinking about the reviewers who I'm going to invite to review this paper. Because the cover letter don't even know the outcome at this stage. But I'm thinking, this is important. And even if this vaccine doesn't work, we probably need to get it reviewed and have a look at it and find out more. So that's what a good cover letter does. It speaks directly to the editor, it engages them, it excites them. It not only makes them want to read the paper, it makes them think about reviewers while they're reading the cover letter. The other thing you can say in the cover letter is, if the journal's part of a larger group, would you want your manuscript passed on to another journal? Something we do automatically at The Lancet, but be aware of that for journals that have that option. So what happens then when we send something out for peer review? You've gone through triage, your great abstract because you know how to use the 5 hows, your strong cover letter because you paid attention today have got you through triage. You went to the editorial meeting, the editors agreed, and now they want external peer review. So we aim for 3 experts, try to get 1 from the same country if possible, and 1 statistician. If it's an economics paper, we'll also get a health economist. If I find I'm struggling to get reviewers, I might look at the author recommendations and do a Medline search. Disappointingly, I very often find that the types of people who are suggested often have an inadequate publishing footprint for one to invite as a reviewer. So if you do suggest a reviewer, make sure they're good. And I want the external peer reviewer to give me a specialist view of the paper. And the final decisions are always editorial. So if you're asked to be a reviewer, and hands up in this room, how many people who've done peer review? One hand going up a little bit in front. Anyone else been a peer reviewer? Okay, Good, brilliant. So it's a recognition that you are experts, and it's a position of trust. There's an enormous responsibility as a reviewer to the authors, to the editors, to science, and to society. We want reviews to be objective. They should always be respectful of the manuscript, constructive in their comments, thorough, and they should also be confidential. So ask an editor before you invite a colleague to do the peer review with you. Incidentally, I think joint peer review, particularly with someone who's a PhD student, I think is a terrific idea. We invariably say yes when we're contacted. Good learning experience all round, but this is confidential, so you should ask before sharing it with anyone else. And also we ask reviews are returned on time. Terribly important for authors and for editors. So I want to learn from a peer review, is this important to the field? I do not want to learn where the peer reviewer thinks a comma should go. I want to know, is this novel? Is the design appropriate? Are they convinced by the findings? Is it going to change practice? And I guess a story I'd share with you. We saw the H. pylori paper earlier. A few years ago, a couple of Australians, which no one had ever heard of, Warren and Marshall, sent a paper into the Lancet claiming that they had found a bacterium in stomach specimens. The peer reviewers unanimously criticized the paper. They said this must be a contaminant, it's nonsense. Everybody knows that bacteria cannot survive in the stomach, which is a sterile environment. It's always an editorial choice, so risking the wrath of the reviewers, who said reject, we decided to accept the paper, and I suspect you all know what happened next. Warren and Marshall got the Nobel Prize, and H. pylori is something that we no longer operate for, or only rarely. So, you know, reviewers are important, but the people to get angry with when your paper is rejected is not the reviewer, it's the editor. Because the reviewers may all say this is great, but the editor, for whatever reasons, may actually say yes, but it's not a priority for us. Okay, so you get invited to do a revision. First thing, be happy. Lots of people, they get the revision letter, they look at criticisms, and they get sad. Be happy, because the journal thought your paper was strong enough for peer review, and now the journal wants to see if it's strong enough to publish. So you are very, very close to getting published. Think of all of that time refining the question, institutional review board, all the research, all the writing, and you're so close. So don't blow it at this stage, because an invitation to revise does not imply acceptance. What do we want from the revision? We want a serious engagement with the reviewer's comments that is reflected in your revised text. We want extra clarity. The revision process should give clarity to the manuscript. It should enhance the scientific accuracy. We want to make sure that the results are clearly supported by the findings. And we want the review back in a timely, revision back in a timely fashion. So usually the purpose of a revision is to make the paper strong enough for publication. Sometimes it might be because there are serious shortcomings and we want to see whether it is possible to get over them. So there are certain do's and don'ts at the Lancet. And journals differ, so you'll want to refer to author information and to your revision letter for each journal. I think it's really important to clearly document changes. So to give a point-by-point response to the reviewers, to put the exact text underneath the reviewer's point in the revision letter, and the line number on the tracked changes revision where it can be found, and in doing so, beware that line numbers and formats can be corrupted between Windows-based and Mac-based systems. It's really nice to begin with some sort of thank you like this. I see a letter like that at the beginning of a revision, and I cannot help but feel a sense that we're on the same page with the author. It just starts a really good relationship. And that doesn't cost you anything to write a letter like that. Even if you're furious with the reviewers, you can still write a nice introduction. Some things don't go down well in responses to reviewers' questions, and one of them is to be argumentative. So the quickest way to rejection is to argue each point raised by the reviewers. It doesn't help to respond to the reviewer's points in a letter, but not to make any changes in the text. The point of revision is to improve the text, not to show off in the letter. Don't feel you have to respond slavishly to remarks about style. Certainly at the Lancet, because every manuscript is going to be edited in-house, and our house style may be different from that reviewer's style. I mean, for instance, it would be, could you imagine, for instance, a reviewer saying, please change everything to American English, to then change everything to American English, only to have us edit it back into proper English. And specifically, don't undertake any analyses that were not pre-specified in the protocol. So what happens when there are disagreements? Use evidence to support your rebuttal. We note the reviewer's concern about this point. We respectfully suggest that a paper published 2 weeks ago shows such and such, and therefore we would like to keep the text as it is. Whatever the disagreement is, be respectful and use evidence in your argument. You could always add the line, however, we're happy to defer to the editors. I mean, unless this is a deal breaker for you, it's a nice, gives you a little bit of wiggle room, and it means that if the responses go back to the reviewer, it leaves the door open for the reviewer to interpret it as she or he wishes, and then for the editors to act as they see fit from their perspective. But that's another point about going back to reviewers, is we may ask a reviewer to look at your manuscript again and your responses, so you want them to be polite and full, as if you were conversing directly with that reviewer, regardless of whether or not they've necessarily been polite to you. But sometimes there are uncertainties. Sometimes you'll get one reviewer who tells you to do one thing, and another reviewer who will tell you to do absolutely the opposite. And that puts you in a difficult situation. You may also be uncertain as to what should go in the main paper versus a web appendix, particularly when there are word limits involved. Or when you've been asked to put in extra information, but it'll make the paper substantially longer. So if those things happen, you already have a dialogue with the editor through the revision process, through the letter the editor has sent to you. So simply ask the editor. And it's probably good to do that before you send your response in. So send an email, say we're going through the responses. We have a couple of questions. Please could you clarify how you would prefer we respond to these? This also helps build the relationship between you and the editor. Okay, the R word. 4,500 submissions, 200 acceptances. Simple maths. When journals receive more submissions than they can publish, rejections are inevitable. That doesn't mean they're necessarily right. As editors, we're choosing the manuscripts that we believe most subscribers will want to read. And manuscripts compete with one another, and it depends how many cardiac stent studies we've published in the last couple of months. It depends on the journal stock, maybe on upcoming theme issues that might make us more sympathetic to a certain subject. Sometimes good submissions are unlucky. Rejection is not intended to be personal. You, the authors, and your submissions are valued. And we get it wrong sometimes. So if you think we've got it wrong, appeal. Indicate why you think the editors may not have appreciated the importance of your paper. Provide evidence to refute reviewers. Don't do a revision at this stage, but say, I think this reviewer is mistaken, and show us why. And demonstrate how your paper will influence practice. So I'd like to end with some words by the poet Yeats about submissions. I'll let you read these for yourselves. So we recognize your research are your dreams, and we don't want to trample on that. So in conclusion, what do we look for? Research that's going to change thinking, that's of interest to a wide audience, that first and last publication that defines the arch, ethically sound, methodologically robust, and reported in full. Thank you.